In this tutorial, we're going to talk about the LFO section in Program Edit, and to get to this section, we're going to click on the menu button, and we're going to scroll over to the LFO page and press F8 to open. And there's a couple of different tabs here at the bottom. There's Oscillator 1 LFO 1, Oscillator 2 LFO 2. There's 2 LFO 1 and 2 LFO 2, and those pertain to Oscillator 2. So what do we have here? Essentially, each oscillator has 2 LFOs that it can use to control any of the 3 parameters that we discussed, which would be filters, pitch, and amplitude. So what different type of parameters can you assign to the LFO? We're going to cover these one by one. The first one is the waveform, and it's very common for these to have many different waveforms. The first one is like a triangle, then of course there's saw, there's a few analog type waveforms, and over here on the right you can see those different indications of what those look like. We'll go ahead and dial back in a triangle. The next one is the frequency, and the frequency is the rate at which this oscillator will be oscillating for that LFO, or low frequency oscillator. And again, this value here is not an actual value or a hertz. This is a range of 0 to 99, so keep that in mind. The next one down here is the offset, and this has to do with where the oscillator will begin as is being played, and for the most part you would leave this set to 0, and this means that start point would be at a 0 point in an oscillation. There's also a key sync, and this means that you can sync up the LFO to start when you first press the key, and that's sometimes handy, especially if you have a very low LFO or a very low frequency LFO that's being used and you want a certain type of control or beginning. Let's say the LFO was extremely low to a point where it was being applied to a sweep. You might want to set the key sync to be checked there in that case, so that the characteristics or controls that are being applied by the LFO often sound the same. There's also a fade, and the fade has to do with how gradual the LFO will continue until its strongest point after the key is pressed, and there's a delay, and the delay indicates how long before the LFO will start after the key is pressed. The next few rows of information down here control the frequency modulation, and the frequency can be controlled 2 different ways. You have this default frequency that's manually set up here at the top, but then also you have these AMS or alternate modulation sources that can control the frequency as well. And as it looks like here on oscillator 1's LFO 1, there's an alternate modulation source that's assigned to the note number, and you can tell this because the intensity is increased by 4. So anytime that this intensity value is a value other than 0, you'll know that this alternate modulation source is controlling whatever parameter is to the left of it. So here it looks like as you increase the note numbers, as you go up the scale, the frequency of this LFO would increase, and that intensity, that or the amount that this frequency would increase, is relative to how much is dialed in here, which is a positive 13. You could inversely affect this by dialing in a negative value. So as you went up the scale, or as you increased note numbers, the frequency would decrease rather than increase, and you could do that by dialing in a negative number there. Let's go ahead and set this back to 4. I just want to quickly cover over one last area here that can be controlled, and this is the MIDI/tempo sync And this is a very important portion of the LFO, and this is because a lot of parameters that use the LFO specifically may want to be synced to the tempo of the song that you're working with, or a tempo that's set up in program mode that you're working with. And to do this, you'd simply go down here to the sync box and press any of the value adjustments there, or the increment and decrement buttons, to check this, and then it's going to be synced to the BPM, or the tempo of the sequence or program that you're working with. So that means this frequency up here really doesn't matter. It's this the tempo is going to take precedence. And then it'll ask you what your bass note is going to be. You can dial in any of the notes here to control what that bass note will be, and that simply means that for each quarter note, if you dialed in a quarter note here, then there would be one complete oscillation of that LFO. And if you increase the times here, that there would be 2 complete oscillations for one quarter note, 3 oscillations for one quarter note, etc., etc. And all these other tabs are pretty much the same. You have the same parameters for LFO2 on oscillator 1, and for LFO1 on oscillator 2, and LFO2 on oscillator 2. All these parameters are exactly the same, except that they're controlling their associated LFOs and oscillators.